We already have 23 geeks on the line, so welcome to all of you. Let me see if I can share my screen now as well. And I want to share my desktop. Okay, I should be sharing my screen, which means you should be seeing penguins. And I will try to also get the chat window back wherever that went. So if you have questions, either just unmute yourself and speak up, or write something in the chat window here, and that should work as well. So let me tell you what the question was that I received, and it's actually summarized in this. So the basic question was, if you have a switch workflow, or any workflow actually, where you're using pdfToolbox, is there a way to go from a situation where you have to build separate branches in the workflow for different products, for example, because we're really talking about different products in this case? Is there a way to build that as one switch workflow and then use variables to process that thing? And that's what we're going to attempt to do. I have already prepared some stuff so that we don't have to build everything from scratch, but most of the stuff we have to build from scratch if I want to explain what's going on. Yeah. So this is the basic thing that we're going to do. And one thing that I want to point out here already is that there is always a little bit of analysis going on. So basically for each product, there is a different resolution here that we want to give a warning for. That's what we have here at the bottom. And then there is one thing that we want to do for all of them. Now, the one we want to do for all of them, we can ignore, because that is something that is going to happen in any case. So that's going to be a fixed check. The difficult ones are the ones that we want to do different per product in one profile. So let me see if I can bring up two things. I'll show you what I've prepared first of all. So we're all on the same page, and I'm going to start in Switch actually. So I've prepared this very simple but colorful workflow where you have 3 input folders. Now, of course, there are all kinds of ways that this could be done differently in Switch, but we have to pick one, and this is an easy one to explain. I have 3 input folders, one for leaflet, then poster, and then the banner stuff. And those, if I open up this again next to it, those correspond to the question we had here. So leaflet, poster, and roll-up banner. And then instead of doing 3 different workflows, I bring all the files into one, send it to pdfToolbox, which is now configured with a profile. The profile is empty at the moment, by the way. And then depending on whether I have errors, warnings, errors, I should point to the red one, errors, warning, or success, the files are supposed to go in a different direction. Yeah? And of course, we want the check that we have here eventually, we want that to be specific for the input that we have. I've done one other thing in Switch because I need to be able to demo this in some way, and this is an easy way to do it. For each of the input folders, I have added some private data. So each of these 3 input folders sets some private data on the files that pass through it. And the private data is called FP resolution. And actually, I think it should be an equal sign probably here for, I think I'm already wrong. See? So it's always FP resolution, but in one case it's 300, in the other case it's 200, and then in the third case it is going to be 150. In case you're wondering why I'm wrong because, well, you'll see in a second when we start doing stuff with pdfToolbox why I'm wrong. The syntax that Switch uses for private data is slightly different than the syntax that pdfToolbox uses, and that can be a little bit confusing sometimes. So this is what I prepared. This is the workflow we want to end up with. I have a profile in there yet, but it's empty. And then we have private data that will accompany each file that ends up in pdfToolbox, if we did that properly now. So what have I prepared in pdfToolbox? I have an empty profile, and then I have prepared 4 checks in here as well. And each of these checks resolution. So let's open that. It checks resolution, and it says, in this case, for example, if it's less than 70 DPI, we're going to have a hit. You can see some other stuff in here. There is something about bits per color component. That's because this particular check is for color and grayscale images. And then it also checks whether the height of the image is at least 16 by 16, and if there is at least more than 1 page. The fact that these things are here, we're going to ignore for this session. This is basically, again, to a group check that I picked up. And the reason that you have this, for example, is that you don't want to do resolution check on artifacts caused by transparency flattening. So if the image is too small, we're going to ignore it. Now, if you remember this drawing, there was one check that we want to do in any case, and that is this one here: fail below 70 ppi. And we can fix that already. So we could say in our profile. And I'm going through this relatively quickly because otherwise it's going to take me 4 hours, but it is recorded as well, and we'll make the recording available afterwards, so you can look back to what happens here. But this check I'm going to simply add, and it is only when I'm adding it to a profile that I can choose whether it's a fail or a warning. So the default is fail, and that's exactly what our instructions here said. It should be a fail below 70 ppi. So we've already covered that part of the question. Yeah, that was the easy part as well, but we've covered that, so that's good. These are a little bit more tricky because, well, I can hardly have all of them in there. They do work. I have a nice file here that if I run analyze, it will give me some color images, and then under trigger values, I can see what the actual resolution of the image is. So they do work. They're 150 or below. If I do below 150, then there are not going to be any errors because the images are 150. So I get a different result depending on whether I run below 300 or below 150. So that's good. But I only want one check, and I want the check to be variable. Yes, because we want to be able to make one profile. So in any scenario where you want to do variables in Switch and then feed them to pdfToolbox, you have to start on the pdfToolbox side because you have to prepare the pre-flight check, the profile that contains the variables first of all, and then I'll show you how to feed data into them from within Switch. But we have to start here in pdfToolbox. And what we can do is duplicate this check. And actually what I'm doing here is what I would usually probably do as well. This is for me at least, the fail-safe way of implementing it is that you first make a check that doesn't have any variables and you try whether it works. And when you know that you can make a static check, then you copy the static check, and now we are going to make it variable. And to start with, I will just indicate in the name that this is a variable. Well, actually what I will do is I will say image resolution is too low. This is a variable check, so what else can we do? We can do it better. I'll get to that. But for now, I'm just going to give this a different name, and where I have the 150, we're going to insert a variable. And variables in pdfToolbox are really, really straightforward. I'm always surprised by that fact, but they're really easy to use. So the only thing I do is I'm going to say I want a variable. Let me make this a little bit smaller. And then every variable has two possible types. It can be a simple value, and that means that the value of the variable is going to be or can be filled in from outside the profile. So someone else can decide what the value is and then pass it on to pdfToolbox. That is the simple value choice. It can also be a script. And the script choice is, well, and then it crashes pdfToolbox, of course. It can never go, I don't know, but it can never go well during a demo from the first try. I really don't know why. So let's do that again. So here, yes, it quits unexpectedly, I know. So let's do this again. So we want a variable in here. Yes. So what I was explaining is that on the one hand, it can be a simple value. On the other hand, it can be a script. And when it's a script, it's calculated inside of pdfToolbox. So in that case, you don't have the choice of getting something from Switch and passing it on to pdfToolbox. The script variable is calculated inside of pdfToolbox without getting a value from outside. It can still use other variables that are simple variables, but for now we need a simple variable. And then I need to specify 3 bits here. The first one is the variable name. And that is a developer name if you want. It is best if it follows the same kind of rules. The convention that I have is that it starts with var, and then I can say var resolution because that's what we're going to do. Then it has a label, and the label is only used in pdfToolbox desktop, and you'll see why in a second. So I could say minimum resolution, for example. And then it has a default value. And the default value is also a very easy concept. If you just run the check and you don't do anything, then the value that is going to be used is 150. Yeah. So let me just say okay, and let me say okay on this. And now I have a new check that is now called image resolution is too low. It has these 3 black dots at the top of the icon now. That's because if that is still visible across the Zoom broadcast. But these dots mean that this is a check that contains a variable. And when we put this variable in our profile, you'll see that the profile will pick up these 3 little dots as well. So what happens if we run this? So if I take my file again and we say analyze, instead of just doing it now, I get this window that says minimum resolution, which was the label that we entered into our variable. And I have a value here of 150, which corresponds to the default that I put in my variable. But now I can, of course, say I want to check with 200, and then I'm going to get an error. You can see that the variable that was used, this var resolution, was set to 200 because that's how I set it. And I get errors in here because the images are 150 dpi and I checked for 200 dpi. Yeah? So that seems to work. There is one thing that annoys me, and as long as we're doing this, we're going to do it properly. What annoys me is that I had to change my error message here, and it now says just image resolution is too low. And why did I change it? Well, because the PPI value that so the resolution value that I check against can be anything I want. Yeah. So it's a little bit more difficult to have a proper error value for that. But what I can do is I could say, is below. And now I'm going to use one of the very nice features of pdfToolbox, and that is that variables, when you create them, are a separate entity, and they live in my current library. So whenever I create a variable, like this thing here, this var resolution thing that I created, that becomes an object, and that object lives in my library. And I can use it in multiple places. Once it's created, I could use it in a different check, or I can use it in the name of the check that I have here. Many people are tempted to say, oh, I want to use it there, so I'm going to do copy paste and put it in there. Unfortunately, that doesn't work. You really have to go through this variable triangle that you have here, and then just pick the same variable there. And now you can say that it says below 150. And what I forgot to do, and we can just as well do it properly, is I'm going to add PPI at the end of this. Of course, that already exists. Okay, because the name is the same. Let's do something here. Let's change the default value to something that doesn't exist somewhere else. Don't be annoying, I changed it. Okay, we insert it again there. Now, can you please allow me to do it? There we go. Yeah, so it still shows me something now. Why? Well, it shows me what the default value is of that variable that I inserted in the name. So I can use variables not just in the properties of the check that I'm building, but I can also use them in the name of the check that I'm building. And if I run this now, and I change the 777 to 66 because I wanted to fail on something, then, if I wanted to fail, I should make it a higher value, not a lower value. So 777 is actually fine, but we'll have something even higher. There we go. So image resolution is below 888 ppi. So it uses the value of the variable that we put in here when we ran the check, and it will actually also insert that into the name of the error message that is generated. And this, of course, is important. I will explain you why while I actually fix this typo that we have, and I'm going to fix it on the fixed one and on the variable one. Oh, the variable one is fine. Good. Now it's moved. This one is still wrong. Why is this important? Well, it's important because in the name of the check that you have here and the error that is reported is also what's going to end up in a pre-flight report. So if we can use variables to make the reported error in pdfToolbox better, then it is also going to make our pre-flight report better, because the error that people are going to see in the pre-flight report is actually going to make sense. Yeah? So that gives us a variable check, and now we can simply modify our profile again and insert the variable check, easy to identify because it has the little black dots there. And we're going to put that in our profile. But if you remember correctly, this variable one should be a warning, not a failure. So I'm going to select it in my profile, and I'm going to make it a warning instead of an error. And now that we've done that, our profile also gets the 3 little black dots because it's now a variable profile. Yeah, and let me just confirm by running this. When I run it, pdfToolbox will look at all of the different checks that contain variables. It will show me this window with all the variables that are used. And now I can say I want to check against 350 perhaps, and then run that. And I am not getting any error messages on the below 70 because there is no image here that is below 70. But I am getting a warning message below 350 because the images are all 150, if you remember that part correctly. Yeah, so that is the part in pdfToolbox. Let me summarize very briefly. What I've done is I've made one fixed check on resolution because we want to give an error if it's less than 70 for all products. And now I've also created a variable check because depending on the product, we want to give a warning message that, well, is under, that the file is under a particular resolution check for that particular product. I've created those, we've tested them, and I put them in a profile that I have also tested. Does that make sense for everyone? Are there any questions about this, perhaps? Remember, you can type or speak. It is all the same to me, and you can certainly type in different languages, although not any language. Okay, so that seems to make sense. So that's not too difficult. And actually, there is one last thing I'm going to do in pdfToolbox just to show you what's happening. Is when I go to manage libraries, and I have my 4-piece Café library, and I go to checks, you will now see the checks that we've created. There is also an item here called variables. And that shows all of the variables that live in the current library. So this variable that I just created, this var resolution, is in here. If you're ever wondering where you can delete variables, well, this is the only place where you can delete them. You can create them in profiles, process plans, checks, fixes, just about anywhere. But you can only delete them in the library window. Yeah, so you have to go to manage libraries, and there you can delete them. Now, to prove that is not the case here, I can't delete it here because it's disabled. The reason it's disabled is that if I click on this, this variable is used in some location. So it's used by different items in my library. And as long as it is used by a pre-flight check or a fix or a profile, then there is no way for me to delete it in this particular library. Yeah. So I would have to remove the checks, delete the checks that use it or the profile that uses it before I can actually delete it from my library as well. But if you have a library with many variables in it and you want to clean up everything that is not used, then you can do that here. The other reason that I wanted to show this, this manage libraries part is the fact that these variables are objects, standalone objects, has another big advantage. It means that in principle, you only have to create it once in your lifetime. Yeah, because what I can do now is I can go to another library and I could say, oh, in this support library, I would actually like to have this resolution variable as well, because that comes in handy. So I can just copy it to there. Yeah? That's also a very nice use of the fact that these are independent objects. That means that I can simply take something that I created in the past in a different library and copy it to my library. And I don't have to redo that work. It's easy to create variables, but easy doesn't mean it doesn't take any time. If you have 10 things that you want to make variable, it's still going to make time. So if you can copy them from somewhere else, then it's easy to do. The only thing you have to do is then post them or use them in the correct check afterwards. Okay? And by the way, what you can see here is that in this new support library, I just copied it in, so I can still delete it here. It's not used anywhere. When you copy stuff in between libraries, you know that it becomes independent. So if I would now go to my support library and modify the default value of this variable, then the variable that I have in my 4-piece Café library would be completely independent and it would not be modified. Also an important point. So I made one change because I copied that, that's fine. Yeah, so we have this now, and there is one last step I'm going to do in pdfToolbox, and that is I'm going to export my profile that I just created, and I'm going to save it somewhere, and we'll call it check resolution. And just to make sure that I understand which one this is, I'm going to call that variable. And so I'm just saving that in a folder on my system here. So we can use this in pdfToolbox now. That doesn't mean we can use it in Switch, right? So let me show you how to go about that as well. This was the workflow, and I told you that I already used a profile here. Well, I'm going to replace this by the variable profile that we just created. Okay, so if I now run anything through this workflow, regardless of what it is always going to be pre-flighted with a value of 777 PPI, because that's what we put in the profile, and we haven't put variables anywhere. So that's about the only thing that that Switch can do. It's going to give a file to pdfToolbox. pdfToolbox doesn't have any variables set up, so it's going to use the default value of anything that is inside this profile. Yeah, and of course that's not what we want. So what we need to do in the pdfToolbox configurator is we need to look for something that is called, the name is entirely logical. I always find it very confusing, but it is entirely logical when you think of it. It is called define variables for dynamic profiles. A dynamic profile is a profile that uses at least one variable inside, like the one we just created. And instead of saying no, which is the default, I can set that to yes. And then you can see that we get an additional property here, which is list of variables, and it has some value in there already, which is an example. So we don't want to leave that in there. And I'm going to do add a multi-line text to start with. And this shows you the format of what is expected. And now it should also become clear why I was wrong with this private data stuff in the beginning of the workflow. Because when you define private data in Switch, Switch expects a format that is key equals value. When you define variables for pdfToolbox, pdfToolbox expects key colon value. So that's what we're looking at. We're looking at the key or the name of the variable, and then we're looking at the value of that variable. Yeah, and if we want to pass information about multiple variables, then we simply put it on multiple lines. Yeah? Whatever is in here you can remove, because that's just the example. And what we're going to put in is the name of the variable that we created in pdfToolbox. And that was var resolution. We could go back and check, but I'm actually pretty sure in this case. And then we need a colon to separate the name of the variable from the value that we want to pass. And what we could do now is we could say, I want to pass 100 and I don't know, well, let's not make it difficult. I want to pass 333 as the value that is going to be used here. So let's see what happens. And I'm just going to activate this workflow. I hope this all works like advertised, because doing demos like this is always very dangerous, but we'll see. I'm just going to throw it into an input there, and it's been picked up, and it was sent to my warning output, which is exactly what we would expect And of course, I didn't generate a report, so I can't go look at the report now. But we're checking against a resolution limit of 333. Our images are 150, so they are going to fail. And because we set that error or that pre-flight check to warning, that file is going to end up in the warning folder. So that seems to do exactly what I would expect it to do. Unfortunately, it still doesn't solve our problem, because our problem was we don't want to build individual workflows where we set something, but we want one workflow and we want to have a different value depending on the incoming file. So we have to do a little bit extra work here. But we're pretty well advanced. In order to work with variables, because I'm also going to do something with private data now in Switch, I'm going to make my life a little bit easier, and I'm going to process this file again, and I'm going to throw it into the poster entry now. So now it went through one step of my workflow. I put this connection on hold, so the file is actually not processed by pdfToolbox now. And I'm going to stop my workflow. And the reason I'm doing this is because now I have an example file in my workflow, and you'll see why that is important in a second. So if I now go back to my dynamic profile stuff, I'm going to edit this in a slightly different way now by doing define multi-line text with variables. And now it gets a little bit confusing, because you have a variable concept in pdfToolbox and we have a variable concept in Switch as well. We have to clearly define which is which. Yeah? The var resolution that we have here refers to the variable that we have created in the pdfToolbox profile. Yeah? What we want to do is we want to use variables in Switch to define what the actual value is going to be. So instead of 333, this literal value, I want to have something that I pull out of Switch. And this could be something that comes out of an XML that comes in, or maybe something you get from the naming convention from the files. Or in my case, because I was smart enough to set up private data for this job, well, at least that's what we hope I did, I can use private data. So in this dialog, I'm going to say define variables. And now you see why I wanted to have a file that was partially processed through the workflow, because now I have a sample file in this dialog. And when I click on stuff, it is going to show me what the suggested, or what the value is going to be if I would use that variable. Now, I don't want to use the name, but I do want something that belongs to the job. And what I want is I want private data. And now what would be nice is if Switch would show me which private data I have in here, but it doesn't. So I have to remember it. And I remember it correctly, because when I type FP resolution, it shows me that this file that came in has the value 200 as the value for FP resolution. And that is exactly what I would expect. I put that file into the poster input. The poster input associated FP resolution with the value 200. So I'm going to say insert variable and OK. And so now I have the two variable types connected to each other. On the left-hand side, I have the variable that exists in the pdfToolbox profile. So this is what pdfToolbox knows. And on the right-hand side, I have the variable that will pull the value that I want to use from the job that is being processed. Yeah? So this ties the two parts of the workflow together. It connects something that exists in the Switch universe, and it passes it on to something that pdfToolbox knows of in its profile that we're using. So I can say OK, and I can say OK. And then if I now process this file, what I would expect is that because it comes in through poster, it will go into the warning entry because poster checks for 200 dpi and the file contains images that are 150 dpi. So it's below the limit and it's going to go there. And if everything I did was correct, then if I throw another file in there, but this time on the leaflet entrance, it should actually go into success, which it doesn't. So we have to figure out why it doesn't do that. So on the leaflet side, we said, okay, leaflets is 300. I am actually reading this wrong. So this one should be 150, yes. But it helps if you remember what the conditions are that you set up. So if I throw it into banner, then it should go into success. There we go. Yeah. So again, just to recap, what we've done is on the pdfToolbox side, we've set up a profile that has a variable, and the variable is inside one of the checks in here. And it has a name var resolution. That's the first thing we did. And then we've used that profile in our configurator in Switch. That's the variable profile that we created. And then we passed some data from Switch, in this case, private data field that contains the resolution we want to check against. We passed that into that var resolution variable that we put in our profile. So the file comes in, Switch associates some private data with the document. It sends it to pdfToolbox. pdfToolbox knows that that private data needs to be used for the var resolution because that's how we set it up in here. And then it does the pre-flight and outputs the result in the workflow that we want. And of course, we've only done this with one variable now, but where we inserted one variable in this particular case, we could very easily insert a whole bunch of variables in there as well. pdfToolbox allows us to use variables as the value of checks and fixes. So the properties that you use in checks and fixes. It also would allow me to use variables to switch checks and fixes on or off. So you can have one workflow, but for example, I do downsampling or I don't do downsampling, depending on the product that you have or the metadata that comes into this workflow. I can use it to control the severity level of a check or fix. So I could use it to determine whether a particular check is executed as an error warning or whether it's run at all. So variables allow a lot of these things in a pre-flight profile to be controlled. And the only thing you have to do it in Switch is to make sure that this setup that we have in there is correct, and it passes information from Switch into pdfToolbox. Does that make sense? Any questions? Because I think I actually managed to perform the task that was put on my list. I think the workflow that we've built now is doing exactly what the idea was here, except that I don't use magenta, but I use proper red for the error folder, Rob. So I think it does exactly what you what the original question was. If there are any questions about that, please speak up.
Oh, David, it's Robbie. Yeah, thank you for that. Have we got time to look at how you switch a fix on and off in that configurator? You just mentioned that a minute ago. To give you an example, say the check and fix bleed feature. So on a leaflet, you'd want that to perform that. On a roller banner, you wouldn't.
Yeah.
So have we got time just to see that?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
let me. I don't have that example here, so we'll just. Oh, I'll steal something somewhere. So let's say here, and then we want to fix up, and I'm just going to look for something that does bleed, and yeah. Oh, this is already a variable one. We're going to keep it simple. So let's just say this. I just want a fix-up to execute now at the moment. Yeah. So I'm copying that into my library. And yes. So now I have a fix, and I'm going to put this fix into my profile. I could have just looked for it here and then copied it. That would have been faster, but well. So when I put it in there now, it is always going to be run. Yeah, that's the way things are. I have a preflag profile, and it's always going to run the fix-up that I have in here. But at the bottom, you have this thing that says enable fix-up. And I can switch that off, which means that this fix would never be run. That's not better. We want a variable. So I'm going to switch it on, which means that by default, it will be run. But I'm going to make a variable to control that. And you can use the same var convention if you want. My convention typically is to use switch, although maybe that's confusing with switch. So I could say toggle and then create bleed, for example. And what is important here is that because we're using this variable to switch on or off a fix-up, it is going to be interpreted as a Boolean. And that means that if the value is 0, it is not going to be run. If the value is 1, the fix-up is going to be run. Yeah, I think actually whatever value you have, as long as it's not 0, it means that the fix is going to be run. I haven't tested that, but that's how I would expect pdfToolbox to treat this. So anything that is non-0 runs the fix-up. Yeah. So the default value is 1, which means run it. And the name is important. And because I'm lazy, I'm just going to copy that so I don't have to remember it. And I'll still remember it because probably I'm going to copy something else while we're doing this. So toggle create bleeds. Just help me remember this. So say OK. Now this one looks a little bit different, and you can see this this small white square that appears at the bottom of the icon for the fix-up, and that is an indication of the fact that this is now it has a variable, but it's a variable used to toggle it on or off. So this this little thing represents kind of a checkbox next to the fix-up, if you want. You can think of it that way. Yeah? So we've done that. I modified my my profile now. If I now have, well, I now have a fix-up and I have 2 checks in here. So because I'm working with external files, I need to export this again. So export profile. And let's say variable, and just to keep track, I'm going to give it a different name. Okay, now how does this look in pdfToolbox? Well, if I run analyze and fix, or I'm going to tests, so tests, I get the same dialog window as before. It still asks me for resolution because we haven't done anything to those checks that we had in there. But now it also says, well, I have a very bad label for this one. So it says enable fix-up, which is a little bit stupid. So let's fix that because I don't like it. So go back to edit my variable that we had here. And instead of just saying enable fix-up, which is the default, I'm going to say, let's keep to the naming convention, toggle Well, we'll just say create bleed. That makes sense, I think, in the context. So I'm going to say okay, and then do test again. Okay, and now it makes a little bit more sense. It says create bleed. The default is 1, which means on, but I can toggle it off, and then it's not going to do it. So what happens here, even in pdfToolbox already, is that this fix-up is controlled by a variable. If the variable is set to 1, then it is going to create bleed. If the variable is set to 0, it's not going to create bleed. And I can control this in this same window because this is pdfToolbox desktop. Yeah. So this accomplishes what you want in the desktop. In the desktop, I now have a profile where not only can I set the resolution, I can also decide whether I'm going to run this fix-up to create bleed or not. And now we need to figure out how we do that inside of Switch. So we have our profile, and I'm going to export it again. I was exporting it, but we have to do it again because we changed it. So there we go. So back to Switch. We have to make sure that we pick up the correct profile in there. I could have used the same name. There is no reason not to use the same name. In reality, if this would be a production environment for me, what I probably would do is put the date or something like that in the file name, because I like to keep them separate, and I can go back if I screw up at some point. So we've added this. I could just run this workflow now, and then it's always going to create bleed. Yeah, we have an extra fix in there. We have a variable that contains the fix. The variable by default is set to 1. So as long as I don't do anything here in Switch, it is going to simply run this fix up. But of course, our intention now is to go here and then do something with that. But before we do that, let's prepare things on the other side. So now I not only want FP resolution, I also want FP create bleeds. And for a leaflet, I'm going to set that to 1. I told you I was going to copy something without thinking about it. So I hope you still remember what the name of this variable was, because I don't. So let's go back to here, and then we will, well, maybe we don't create bleed for a poster, and for the banner, we're also not going to create a bleed like this. So the leaflet will create bleed, the poster will not, the banner will not. And we need to tell pdfToolbox what to do now. So we can do exactly the same thing. We can say var, did anyone remember what it was? I think it's this. If someone disagrees, then you can tell me, but I think this is what I put in there. And we can do exactly the same thing. Now, I can go through the dialogue again and so on, but that's for amateurs, of course. So I'm just going to copy paste, because I'm assuming I know what I'm doing. And I think I called it FP create bleeds. I'm not sure of that anymore either, but so let's check to make sure. FP create bleeds, and there you go. And actually, this is all that is required to do that as well. Yeah. So on the input side, we've now created 2 private data fields, but again, these things could come from somewhere else as well. They could come from XML, they could come from a file name convention, but we've created 2 private data fields for the job. And on the side of pdfToolbox, we've now matched both of these private data fields to the name of a variable that exists in the pdfToolbox profile. Yeah. So Switch picks up the name of the private data and then passes it as the value of that variable to the profile that you're running. Okay? If you wanted to use this one profile and you don't want to make it variable, you just want to say what's going to happen, I can do this as well, and that's going to work as well. Yeah? And if I would say true, it's going to work as well, because it's a Boolean and it's going to be interpreted as a Boolean. But the most logical thing would be to use a 0 or a 1, depending on whether you want it to run or not. And of course, it makes much more sense to connect it to the value like of the private data key like this. Yes? Okay. More questions?
Just one note for Robert. That's different to the variables that I sent to you when you switch on and off the creation of the bleed for the create and bleed fix up process plan. And the reason for that is that there's a script that colors built in where they really check for the string on and off.
Yeah.
And so that may be confusing.
Yeah.
The correct way to toggle checks and fixes is by using 0 and 1, as David showed it. It's just different for the check and fix bleed process plan that Colors provides. There it has to be the string on or off.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. And that is a bit of a weakness, if you want, of this setup, is that, but it's generically in Switch as well, is that you have to know what you're working with. So if you have a pdfToolbox profile on the one hand, and then you have your Switch workflow on the other hand, you have to make sure that these two things talk to each other. And that means that whatever names you think of in the on the pdfToolbox side, you have to make sure that you use those exact names in Switch, or it's obviously not going to work. One of the biggest reasons of having to try and figure out why a workflow doesn't do what you want, at least in my my experience, is that you make a typo somewhere, or you think you remember the name of the variable and you don't, and you use something else. So you have to make sure that what you use on pdfToolbox desktop is exactly the same as what you use in Switch. Yeah, there is a lot more we could say about variables, but I think if you look at the basic stuff in pdfToolbox, how to create them in pdfToolbox and then how to connect that into a Switch workflow, this really is the essence of what you need to know. If you have other questions, then feel free. I mean, my dinner is not ready yet. So feel free to ask, or if you think of other questions with regards to variables afterwards, then feel free to post them in the 4-piece Café, or just send me an email, and we can see if we can handle those as well. What I have not touched at all here is script variables, and that's a completely different animal. Because those are things where you calculate stuff inside of pdfToolbox itself, rather than having it come in from in the Switch environment. So that is a completely different way of working. They can be combined, but yeah, that's a different story that would require a different demo as well. But what we do here is just two simple variables that are passed in from the outside. We could still, in our pdfToolbox profile now, we could do some calculations with these variables and do something with that. Or we could, instead of, if there's a file naming convention, for example, instead of feeding stuff from within Switch, you could look at the name of the file that comes in and then determine in the profile determine what that means. Yeah, if you know that every banner is going to start with the word banner at the beginning of the file name, then you could make a pdfToolbox profile that doesn't use simple variables, but that uses a script variable, looks at the file name, sees whether the first part of the file name is banner, poster, or leaflet, and then sets the resolution dependingly. That's also a possibility. Typically, it's not what I like to do in a Switch workflow. What I prefer to do in a Switch workflow is use either variables in Switch or scripting in Switch to do input control, set up like what was done here, set up private data fields, and then pass that into variables into the profile. But that's a matter of taste, and it depends a little bit on what exactly you want to implement as well. But it's all possible. Yes?
And what's also possible, whoever wants to go into scripting, you also can create a JSON, stringify it, and pass it as variable into pdfToolbox, and then parse it there and work with the JSON from there. So whenever you get into scripting, it's better to only pass one variable as a JSON, in my opinion, than pass like 10, 20, 30 variables that you then pick up in the JavaScript in pdfToolbox.
Yeah, it's certainly easier, and it's easier to maintain afterwards and modify as things go as well. Totally agree. Yeah, but talking about scripting variables would then we have to talk about JavaScript and so on. So that might be a different class of geek who is interested in that. I don't know. I'm always very happy to talk about that as well, but then maybe we need to set up a separate cafe for that. You're all very quiet, so either I'm the only one who is not drinking anything yet, or it's all very clear. I don't know. It could be either of those, I guess.
No, it's very interesting. I didn't realise that you could add private data with a folder in Switch. That's new to me. I didn't realise that.
Yeah, it's one of those small things that was added to Switch at some point. It wasn't there when I still developed Switch, and I was very surprised to find it at some point. But it can be really useful.
Yeah.
I thought it could only be done during scripting. But yeah, so any folder that you have in the middle of a workflow somewhere, you can add private data, and if the file passes that folder, that private data is picked up. So it's a very cool thing, and we've started to use it more and more. The only annoying thing that I find is that if I would set private data on this folder for it, or even what I'm doing here, it is not always. It's not obvious in Switch that there is private data being set. So you're building workflows where you think that there is a regular folder somewhere to pass things along. And in reality, it's a folder where you also set private data. And I find that a little bit dangerous.
I set a special color on folders I add private data to, so you know there's something happening in that folder.
Yeah, that's actually a good idea. I already do that for input and output folders. The rest is supposed to be yellow, but that's actually a good idea. For connections, we have the convention here that any connection that does something tricky should identify itself as well. And you could do that by color as well, but then it becomes a coloring book after a while. So the convention that we use here is that there are asterisks in the name of the connection. So you can see in a glance, if you look at the workflow, you can see that this connection probably does something in terms of filtering or something like that, and that helps. At least it helps you from stopping. Well, you might remember that you can't just delete that connection because you're throwing away filters or something like that. So we try to do that, but the folder color I haven't done yet. That's a good idea.
Mm.
And you know, Robert, there are companies, consultancy companies that offer enhanced switch training and scripting.
You know one?
Yes.
Yeah.
Especially when you're working with scripting and metadata, there's a whole shitload of possibilities that suddenly are open to you, what you cannot use by just using the regular switch properties with click and drag and drop.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm.
Any other questions? Great. Have a very nice Easter weekend. Don't forget to go search for chocolate eggs. I saw some stuff on Facebook that says that the Easter Bunny is an approved essential worker, so there should be chocolate eggs to be found somewhere. Have a great weekend, everyone, and I am sure I will see many of you in an upcoming cafe. Have fun.